Hello, everybody. Welcome to our second keynote session of this year's SGP. I'm Julie Dean. I'm together with Keenan Crane. We are program chairs of this year's edition. So for our second keynote of this year's SGP, we are very excited to welcome Geoff Hinton from University of Toronto and Google. I doubt there's any need to introduce Geoffrey Hinton since we are all very familiar with his work, but I'll try anyway. Geoff received his PhD in 1978 from the University of Edinburgh. He did a postdoc at University of Sussex and University of California, San Diego, before joining Carnegie Mellon University as a faculty member. He then moved to the University of Toronto, visited University College London for 3 years before returning to Toronto, where he is now an emeritus distinguished professor working half-time at Google. Listing all of his contributions to the field of artificial intelligence would likely take me the rest of the day, be it Boltzmann machines, variational learning, or more recently, capsule networks. And that's not even counting his contributions to other fields such as data visualization. He was one of the researchers who introduced and popularized the backpropagation algorithm, which is a core component of today's machine learning. In particular, he was the first to use backpropagation algorithm for running word embeddings. And in 2018, Geoff Hinton received the Turing Award together with Jan Lequin and Yoshua Bengio for conceptual and engineering breakthrough that have made deep neural networks a critical component of computing. We are really honored to have Geoff Hinton as a keynote speaker this year to learn all from one of his latest works, a unifying representation called Glom. Geoff, the floor is yours.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is just an imaginary system. It's Vaporware. It doesn't exist. I want to be quite clear about that. It started life as a design document, and the design document got longer and longer. And in the end, I thought, why don't I just publish the design document so I can persuade other people to work on it too? What I'm going to do is, sorry, I've got, Zoom is in the way. Right, there we go. I'm going to talk about a system I call Glom. It combines 3 recent ideas in neural networks, fairly recent: transformers, unsupervised learning, and generative models that use neural fields. And it's my sort of current best bet about how the human visual system might work. So I'm really interested in human vision. Most of you are mainly interested in engineering. And when you do engineering, you can design neural networks however you like. You can give them thousands of layers. You can put in weight sharing. You can do anything you like. There's another field called science where you're trying to investigate something that actually exists. And I'm more interested in that. Unfortunately, I've had more success in engineering, but there we go. I think we can learn a lot from the brain. We can still learn a lot from the brain. And for the last half century or so, the brain was really the only reason for believing that if you take 1 trillion parameters and you set them at random and then you train them by gradient descent, maybe it'll work. Any reasonable person would say that that was not a reasonable thing to expect to happen. I remember in the 80s having long arguments with Stuart and Donald Gieman about whether you could learn a whole bunch of parameters starting from random with no prior knowledge. And the general consensus back then in AI was that this was a crazy idea, but it turned out it was right. So if you want to know how the visual system actually works, there's all sorts of sources of information, and you'd be silly to ignore any of them. The psychological demonstrations of how it goes wrong, and I'll give you one of those. There's weird effects of brain damage. I don't have time to talk about those. There's the actual hardware it runs on. So there's the anatomy of the neocortex, the responses of the neurons, the properties of synapses. And then there's what we'll do, which is computer simulations to distinguish what works from what doesn't work. So I think of all those earlier things as just things to be inspired by when you try doing some engineering. Now, one thing that's fairly clear is when people perceive images, they parse them into wholes and parts and subparts and so on. And one question is, how do real neural networks do that? It's not a question that really arises if you've got RAM. You can just have pointers and you can make graphs and it's no problem. But real neural networks don't have RAM. They don't have general purpose memory where you can put anything on the fly. What a neuron does is determine by its weights, and those only change slowly. So how can a static neural net represent a dynamic parse tree, which is different for every image? So in symbolic AI, you just dynamically create a graph. That's no problem because you've got pointers. A theory I worked on for about 5 years with some very good co-workers who managed to make bits of it work, which was remarkable, was called Capsules. And the idea there was, since you can't allocate things on the fly, what you'll do is you'll allocate things ahead of time. So you'll have a whole bunch of capsules, each of which is dedicated to representing a particular kind of part. And when you see an image, you'll activate a small subset of those, and you'll hook them together into a parse tree. So you have to dynamically connect things, but you don't have to dynamically create bunches of neurons that can do things. They're sitting there in advance. I've revised that theory to get rid of the idea that capsules are allocated to particular kinds of things. I've now got more universal capsules, as you'll see. So in Glom, what we do is we allocate hardware to columns, and a column has multiple levels of representation of what's happening in a small patch of the image. So a single patch might be represented by embeddings for a nostril, a nose, a face, a person, and a party. That would be a 5-level hierarchy. And then we're going to use islands of agreement between these embeddings to represent the parse tree. So there is going to be something dynamic, namely these embedding vectors and the islands of agreement between embedding vectors. But we're not going to have to dynamically allocate neurons to do anything. So the idea is all the locations occupied by the same face should have exactly the same embedding vector at the object level, but obviously different embedding vectors at the part level and the subpart level. So now the embedding vectors are things that are acting like pointers. So here's a picture of 5 columns of Glom after the net's been shown an image, and we're going to present static images to the net by treating them as little videos that are very boring. You present a sequence of frames. So it's a recurrent neural net. And after you've presented a sequence of frames of the same image, these are the states of the embeddings in different columns. So at the top level, where you'd have, say, the scene level embedding, that hasn't settled down yet. But at the top level, we want to get the same embedding everywhere. That's a bit like the sort of scene code that you use in neural field models from which you derive all the pixel intensities, but without any intermediate levels at present. At the object level, these 6 columns, happen to be occupied by the same object. So they all have exactly the same embedding vector. These embedding vectors will be thousands of dimensions. 2 is the smallest number of dimensions in which I can show agreement. Then if you look, and so suppose that at the object level, we've got a face. At the part level, we might have a nose represented in red and a mouth represented in green. And all the vectors for the nose, that is all the locations occupied by the nose, get exactly the same embedding vector. All the locations occupied by the mouth get exactly the same embedding vector. And as you go down, you get smaller and smaller islands. And so you can see that those islands form a parse tree. Now, it's a bit more general than a parse tree because you can have disconnected things. That's no problem. And the neural net that we run and that settles down is a bit like a Ising model or Markov random field. Except that it's multi-level. It's using real values instead of binary spins like you use in Ising models. And it's using coordinate transformations between the levels. So the interaction of, say, the part level with the object level involves a coordinate transform, which makes it considerably more complicated. So the embeddings don't talk to each other directly. They talk to each other via a couple of hidden layers that can do the coordinate transform. I'll come back to that when I show you the architecture within a column. Before I do that, I want to convince you about the psychological reality of the part-whole hierarchy and coordinate frames. So most people think coordinate frames were invented by Descartes or somebody like that. Actually, they're invented by the visual system. And I'm going to try and convince you that we really do use coordinate frames. And I'm going to do that by using a demonstration. And it'll work much better if you do the demonstration yourself. And on Zoom, that's fine, because nobody else can see you get it wrong. So here's the demonstration. It goes back a long way. You have to imagine a wireframe cube resting on a tabletop in the normal orientation. And there's a body diagonal that goes through the center of the cube that goes from the front bottom right-hand corner through the center to the top back left-hand corner. So on my fingertips at the ends of that body diagonal. And now what you do is you keep the bottom corner on the tabletop and you rotate the cube so the other corner at the other end of that body diagonal is vertically above your other finger. And then you, using this other finger now, you just point in space to where the other corners of the cube are. Okay, a cube's not a very complicated object. Off you go, point in space to where the other corners are. And actually try doing it. Now, I can tell you what many people do. The modal response is to point to 4 corners. And that's got to be wrong, because if you put a cube in the normal orientation and imagine it now, you can see it has 8 corners. So this is the structure involving the missing 6 corners. So you've got one fingertip above the vertices, the top vertices of those triangles, and another fingertip below the bottom vertices of those triangles. And the 6 corners form a zigzag ring. Now, this is, for most people, not for crystallographers, but for most people, this is an unfamiliar structure. I actually have a cube here. If I stand back, you can probably see the cube. Here's the cube. And that's the structure. And I've colored the edges of the cube so that you also see a particular parse of this structure, because I'm going to use this structure for showing you that we really do parse images. So in this parse, which I call a crown, you have 3 triangular flaps that slope upwards and outwards. I could also see the same set of edges as a green flap like before, sloping upwards and outwards, a red flap sloping downwards and outwards, and a central rectangle. And when you see it like this, you're very well aware that there's a pair of parallel edges, A and D. When you see it as a crown, you're not aware of any pairs of parallel edges. And that's because there's no edges that line up with the coordinate frames you're using. That's when you notice parallelism. But here, the coordinate frame you use for that central rectangle lines up with those edges. You also don't notice in this, when you see the crown, let's go back to the crown. You also don't notice that there's any right angles here. And when you see the cube in this funny orientation, if you perceive it this way, which I'll call a hexahedron, you're completely unaware of the fact that it contains right angles. And if I deform it so the right angles disappear, you don't notice anything funny happening. When you see it as a tilted cube, you're acutely sensitive to the right angles. And if I deform it by 2 degrees, you notice. So it's not right angles that human vision cares about, it's alignment with rectangular coordinate frames. So notice that the 2 paths I showed you were not like the Necker cube. In the Necker cube, when you see the 2 different versions of it, you believe in 2 different realities. Here, the 2 different parses are just 2 different ways of representing exactly the same thing. It's like the sentence, next weekend we shall be visiting relatives, which has 2 different senses, which have exactly the same truth conditions. Okay. So this is a very old diagram made in 1979 that shows the crown, a structural description for the crown in terms of a whole and parts and subparts. And for a graphics audience, it won't surprise you that on the edges, I've put a coordinate transform, and the coordinate transform is the transform that takes you from the intrinsic frame of reference of the crown to the intrinsic frame of reference of one of its parts, like the green flap. That would be RWX. So a structural description of this object will have, just like in the higher levels of old-fashioned computer graphics, you'll have objects with intrinsic coordinate frames, and then you'll have coordinate transforms between the object and the part, and so on for the subparts. And all of this happens kind of above the level at which you're going to do any rendering or anything like that. So this is just a sort of simple computer graphics kind of representation of the geometry of the cube in this funny orientation. And here's the representation for the zigzag representation of the same central 6 edges. Now, there's one other thing we could do, which is we could take this structural description and we could associate with each node the coordinate transform between that node and the viewer. So this is getting more and more like old-fashioned computer graphics. So those things in dark boxes, dark blue boxes, are the relation between the intrinsic frame of reference and the viewer. And one thing to notice about this is, if I take one of the nodes and I fill in that dark blue box the relation to the viewer, I can now propagate that information over the whole structural description, because I just take RWV and multiply it by RWX, and I get RXV. I think that's what a mental image is. Many psychologists think a mental image is made of pixels, but I think the point about a mental image is that your knowledge of the shape doesn't contain the relationship to the viewer. It's independent of the viewer. But as soon as you visualize the shape, what you're doing is choosing a viewpoint and imagining things from that viewpoint. That allows you to propagate consistent viewpoint information over the whole structural description. And now if I asked you for the relationship between two parts that are far apart in the structural description, like A and D, if you want to know the relation of A and D, you can go through 4 edges in the structural description, or you can simply take RAV and RDV, and from those two, from their relation to the viewer, you can figure out the relation between them. And I think that's what we use mental images for. So let me give you an example. I'm going to give you a little mental imagery task. You go a mile east, and then you go a mile north, and then you go a mile east again. What's your direction back to your starting point? And it's obviously sort of southwest, but a bit more west than south. And when you ask people to do that, normal people anyway, they imagine, they form a mental image. And I can tell you something about the mental image you formed. It wasn't tiny. It wasn't this tiny little image that you can only just see it. And it wasn't huge. It wasn't, so you had to sort of move your head to be able to see all of it. And also, it wasn't tilted 45 degrees. It was so north was vertical. And the fact that you know all those things about the image you formed suggests that images really do have viewpoints. And that what a mental image is using an assignment of viewpoint information to allow you to compute other relationships. Okay, that's enough on mental images. I now, before I give you the Glom architecture, I want to introduce one more idea, which is contrastive self-supervised learning. I introduced this with Sue Becker in 1992, but we didn't convince anybody about it, so it got forgotten and got reinvented in about 2016. And the idea is, from different patches of the image, you'd like to extract exactly the same representation. Or you'd like to extract representations that have simple relationships to one another. So we used it for automatically learning about surface depth from random dot stereos. More recently, it's been used far more effectively for learning representations of scenes. So I'll just talk about Simclair, which was developed in Toronto. Other groups developed things earlier. Simclair worked particularly well, but other groups have also developed things that work particularly well. So you take an image X, you take two different crops of X, those are Xi and Xj, and then you put those two crops through the same neural network, F, which will be a deep neural network, something like a ResNet, and you get a representation, H, of those two different crops. You then put that through something that shrinks it, reduces its dimensionality, that's G, and then you try and make Zi and Zj agree with each other. Now, if you just try and minimize the squared difference, it's fairly obvious what will happen. They'll both go to 0 or to a constant, and whatever image you put in, Zi and Zj will agree, because Zi and Zj will be the same for all images. So that's no good. What you mean by agreement is the things vary, but they co-vary. They vary together. And Sue Becker and I had one way of optimizing that. And it turns out a better way to optimize it is to use contrastive learning, where you say, if Xi and Xj come from the same image, I'd like Zi to be similar to Zj. And if they come from different images, I'd like Zi to be different from Zj. But as long as they're moderately different, I don't make them any more different. They just have to be more different than things that come from the same image. Okay. And that works very well for extracting representations of scenes. And if you happen to have a database that where objects and scenes are pretty much the same thing, like ImageNet, it'll work for extracting representations of objects. And so after you've extracted those representations, you can then just apply a linear classifier, just one layer of weights followed by softmax. And that'll do classification as well as something like a somewhat smaller ResNet trained supervised. And all you're doing now is training the final layer of weights. Now, there's a problem with this kind of contrastive learning. It's not really intuitively satisfying. If you, at least not for finding objects, if you take two different patches of an image, two different crops, one patch might contain A and B, and the other patch might contain A and C, and you don't really want to get exactly the same output vector for both patches. What you want is to get the same output vector for the two bits that contain A, and different vectors for the bits that contain B and C. And Glom is designed to overcome that problem by using attention. So really what we're trying to do, think about a face and a nose and a mouth. We want to get an island of identical vectors at the object level to represent the face. And we have an island of identical vectors for representing the nose, and a different island of identical vectors for representing the mouth. And we want to take those nose vectors and those mouth vectors and make them the same. So we get the same face vector from both of them. And the way to do that is to make the nose predict the face via a coordinate transform, and make the mouth predict the face via a coordinate transform. And now we can convert these representations that are very different from one another, the nose and the mouth, into identical representations, which are representations of the face that contains them. So you can think of Glom as it's looking for spatial coherence of a very special kind. It's a spatial coherence induced by familiar shapes. And it's spatial coherence that you can only find if you do coordinate transforms. It was partly inspired by biology. So in biology, every cell has a complete set of instructions for making proteins, and the environment of a cell determines which proteins it actually expresses. So that vector of protein expressions of a cell is like the vector of multiple level embeddings in Glom. And an organ is like an object. It's a bunch of cells that have very similar vectors of protein expressions. And of course, it seems wasteful to replicate knowledge in cells, to have the knowledge in every cell, which we do. But that's just like replicating weights in a neural net. And it makes life very convenient. I'll come back to the issue of whether neural nets can really replicate weights later. So a column of hardware that represents what's going on in one patch of an image, one small patch of an image, is the equivalent of a cell. And the vector of protein expressions of a cell is like the multiple embedding vectors in a column. And before I present the architecture, one more disclaimer. Vision is really a sampling process. The outer loop is deciding what to process in detail. For each time we fixate, we reuse the same neural net. And obviously, there's an interesting reinforcement learning problem in how you decide where to fixate. I'm going to sort of finesse that by saying, I'm only going to talk about what happens on the very first fixation. So here finally is the architecture. And this is the architecture for what goes on in a single column. And this would then be replicated across thousands or tens of thousands of columns. So this shows you 3 levels of embedding. Let's focus on level L and look at the right-hand side level L embedding there. It has 3 sources of information in this picture, and there's one more source that I'll come to later. There's a bottom-up neural net that takes the level L-1 embedding at the previous time step, and via a coordinate transform predicts the level L embedding at the level above. So if you've got a nose, you can predict the face, but you need a couple of hidden layers in your bottom-up neural net to do that. There's a level above at the previous time step, level L+1, which would be, actually, let's say level L-1 is a nostril, and level L is a nose, and level L+1 is a face. So the face would predict the nose top down via a neural net that again has a couple of hidden layers. And then those green arrows are just temporal integration if you're looking at static images, but they'd be more interesting for videos because they'd encode some of the dynamics. Then there's one more interaction, and that's the interaction with nearby columns. So those blue and red and green interactions were all interactions within a column. So they're spatially very local. And that's where all the heavy lifting is done. It's done spatially locally. And then the interactions between columns are very simple. They're simply attention-weighted averaging. So what the level L embedding tries to do in a column is it tries to agree with the level L embeddings in nearby columns, provided they're already similar. So that's what the attention weighting is about. So the level L embedding at location X takes a scalar product with the level L embedding at location Y. It exponentiates that, and then it normalizes that over all the other locations Y that it's looking at. And that tells it how much to average, what weight to give to the embedding at location Y when updating the embedding at location X at level L. So that's just a very simple version of transformers. You're using an exponentiated scalar product to do the attention, but you're making the embedding and the key and the query and the value all be the same thing. So it's a really stripped down version of transformers. And it relies on a theorem. The theorem's generally not much relevance to neural nets, but I think it might be relevant here, which is that if you want a function of multiple arguments, so you want the embedding at a high level to depend on what's happening at many locations. So it's going to be a function of many locations. But for a function of multiple arguments, you can always implement it by using functions of one argument, followed by adding, followed by a function of the resulting scalar. So an example you're very familiar with is if you want to multiply 2 numbers together, you can do that by adding. You just take their logs, you add the logs, and then you exponentiate. So the only thing there that had 2 arguments was the adding, and that's generic. Whatever you want to implement, you can make the interactions just be adding. So my argument is the only interactions we need between localities is just adding or averaging. Now, what that averaging does, of course, is cause embeddings that already agree with one another to get more similar. So as the network settles down, it forms these islands, and the islands are like echo chambers. Echo chambers are a very bad idea if you're doing politics, but they're a very good idea for doing segmentation. So that's how we would like to get these islands. Now, there's a problem with making an object vector, the face vector, the same as all locations occupied by the face, because the face vector has to predict top down the nose vector in some locations and the mouth vector in other locations, and they're quite different vectors. So it can't be a deterministic net that goes from the face vector to the nose vector, because the same net has to go from the face vector to the mouth vector, and it's exactly the same face vector. And that's where neural fields come in. Obviously, what we have to do is give it an extra argument, the top-down net, which is the location it's making the prediction for. So as long as the face vector contains information about the pose of the face relative to image coordinates, then if you tell it one of the locations occupied by the nose, it can figure out where that in image coordinates, it can figure out where that location is relative to the intrinsic frame of reference of the face, because it knows the relation between the face and the image. And so now it can decide whether it should be expressing a mouth or a nose. And now it can produce the right vector. So hierarchical neural fields are kind of essential for making this work. Just in case you don't know what neural fields are, but I think many of you know much more about them than I do, here's a very simple example of a neural field. Suppose we have 4 pixels and they have an intensity gradient. So the intensity is AX plus B, where X is the location. There's something uniform about them, namely it's a uniform gradient. And we'd like to represent all these pixels as being in some sense the same. They're part of the same gradient. And we can do that by representing them by the coefficients A and B. So all 4 pixels now have an identical representation. And what's more, we can reconstruct the pixels from this representation, provided we give the decoder the location that we're reconstructing for, because then we can implement that equation. So that's a very simple example of a neural field. I already said that. That's how the top-down prediction works. The bottom-up prediction is more complicated. So the problem we have to deal with is that parts can be ambiguous. Unlike in computer graphics, where you're generating the images so you know what you're generating, even if it's stochastic, you make a stochastic decision and then you know what you're generating. In perception, you have this ambiguity. You find parts, but you're not quite sure what they are. So suppose we find a possible nose and a possible mouth, and we'd like them to disambiguate each other. One way they could do it is by using a transformational random field. That is, the possible mouth says, in order to confirm that this is a mouth, I'd like to find a nose. And I'd like to find a nose with a particular pose relative to the image. And I can get this pose by applying the coordinate, taking the pose of the mouth, applying the coordinate transform between a mouth and a nose, and that's the kind of nose I want to find. So if you're using standard transformers, each time you'd have to, the mouth would have to create a query that involved a coordinate transform that then matched the key for the nose, and the value for the nose would have to involve another coordinate transform that it gives to the mouth. So it'd be quite complicated in a transformer. You can get it to work, and we got that to work in stacked capsule autoencoders, but it's complicated. And it involves n-squared interactions, each of which involves a coordinate transform. And they're non-local interactions. So something much simpler, if we could get it to work, would be to use a Huff transform and to say, don't let the parts interact directly. Make each part predict the whole. But since the part's ambiguous, it's going to have to make an ambiguous multimodal prediction for the whole. So that's going to be complicated. And the question is, can we get the networks to do it properly? So like if you see a circle, that could be a left eye or a right eye or the front wheel of a car or the back wheel of a car. And if you haven't yet disambiguated the circle, then you're going to have to make this multimodal prediction at the next level up. Now, the multi-level prediction that you're making is for the same locality. It's for the next level embedding of the same locality. So there's no dynamic routing required, which is good. And the way you now get things to confirm each other is at the next level up, you just need simple agreement. You're looking for multimodal predictions in a bunch of nearby localities that all have a common mode. And you can pick out that common mode by running this iterative net that is averaging things with very similar other things, and that'll pick out common modes. If obviously you don't want to just average everything willy-nilly, because now you won't find you'll be averaging with things that are parts of different objects. So if you ask how could a neural net implement this, because you're doing averaging or addition to combine distributions, the things you're combining have to be log probabilities. When you add things together in order to combine distributions, these are log probabilities. And so you can think of each neuron in an embedding vector as a basis function in an unnormalized log probability space. That's what the neuron represents. The activity of the neuron represents the coefficient on that basis function. The basis functions can be very vague because you're only trying to represent one thing at a time. You're not sure which thing it is, but there's only one thing there, you believe. And so you have these very vague basis functions in individual neurons. The activities of the neurons are the coefficients on them. And you just add all these functions together in the log probability space. And that way you get a representation of what the embedding vector represents. And that can be much sharper than the individual basis functions. So we have actually implemented a little bit of it. I didn't produce a good visualization for you. On the left is a whole bunch of data, which is just ellipses, which are highly ambiguous. And we have objects like faces and sheep, which are different organizations of ellipses. But the individual parts tell you nothing about what the objects are, almost nothing. And we put it through a version of Glom. I'm running out of time, so I won't go into details. But on the right, you see reconstructions from the object level, which look exactly like the left, which shows you that from the object level, it could reconstruct all these ellipses, and it did the right thing. Sorry about that, but I'm going to have to cut this bit out. In training Glom, an obvious way to do it, unsupervised, is the same way as you train BERT for language models. You take an image, you remove part of the image, and then you ask it, after it's settled down, to have filled in that part of the image. And then you back propagate the error in filling in that part of the image through the whole architecture. That's not sufficient to encourage the embeddings to form nice islands. And so we add one more objective function, which is where contrastive learning becomes relevant. And the objective function is trying to encourage islands. And so you've got a bottom-up neural net, and you've got a top-down neural net, and you've got averaging with other locations. And all of those contribute to the next embedding at a particular level in a particular location. And I'll call that the consensus embedding. So the consensus embedding is the result of bottom-up, top-down, things from the same level at the previous time, and things from the same level in other columns. That's like the posterior, that's the consensus. And now what you do is you train the bottom-up and top-down neural nets to agree with the consensus. And because the consensus has taken information from nearby locations, that's sharing information between locations. You're training the bottom-up and top-down neural nets to try and fit in with what other similar guys around them want. And so that's training it to form islands. And this suggests something about how the brain can get things like convolutional neural nets. The brain can't share weights. And so in different locations for processing the image, you're going to have different weights. But what we really need to share is not weights, it's the knowledge. And so it's fine for different columns to have very different weights because they have different random architectures initially, provided they have the same knowledge. And we can get the same knowledge in by co-distillation. So what's happening is each net in a location is providing training signals for the other nets by the attentional interactions. And those training signals are transferring knowledge from one location to another location. So attention gating averaging between columns is, I think, what's implementing things like CNNs in the brain, not by weight sharing, but by distillation. I finally want to address a couple of obvious questions like, isn't it very wasteful to have all these embedding vectors that are identical for different locations? Well, it's not wasteful during the search. As you're settling on an interpretation of an image, you don't know which locations are identical. So you need to have these vectors available so that before you're sure, an embedding vector can be this rather ambiguous thing that's not quite sure what should be represented at that location. So you require all these different vectors and all this different hardware for doing the search. After you've settled down, it seems redundant, but that's just like pointers in a computer. You have many copies of the same pointer. That's what pointers are for. So many different things can point to the same thing. And there's something interesting about forming these islands. It's not quite cluster discovery, because in clustering, you're discovering clusters and stuff that already exists. Here, what we're doing is creating clusters of identical vectors. And that's somewhat different from clustering. And I think it should converge faster. And also this replication is less expensive than you might think, because you want longer range spatial interactions at higher levels of the hierarchy. Low down, you want just local interactions. High up, you want long range interactions, but you'd rather not do any more processing than you did when you were low down. So you could use sparse long range interactions. And for sparse long range interactions, you think you're missing stuff. But if actually there's big islands of identical vectors, you only need to sample sparsely to get the information. And because you're exponentiating the scale of products, then one really good fit will outweigh lots of bad fits. So you don't actually need to sample all the different locations in some distant object. You just need to sample a few of them. And people already use that kind of trick in BERT, some versions of BERT. So just to summarize, I showed how to combine some recent ideas in neural nets to make an imaginary system called Glom. And the point of Glom is to solve the problem of how you represent parse trees without doing dynamic allocation of neurons to nodes. And so this kind of replaces capsules models where neurons are allocated to particular kinds of things with embedding vectors, which can represent anything. They need to be bigger than the old capsules, but that you can think of them as like universal capsules. And this was a complicated talk, but you can read all about it in a paper on arXiv. And I'm done.
Thank you a lot for this inspiring talk. I'm sure there are many questions to come, so please don't hesitate to raise your hand and mute yourself once. So Derek has a question.
Yes, thank you for this great talk. I have a question about the architecture. So you have the top-down network from level +1 to level L, and you have also some bottom-up networks. But I'm just curious, does it make sense to have some, for example, skip connections between, for example, level L +1 and level L -1? Because, for example, in the entire scene, and there may be some objects that require more levels to decompose it down to fundamental elements, but then there may be some objects that require less levels.
So there's 2 points I want to make. I think your hardware has some fixed number of levels, like 4 or 5, but think of those levels as a window that you move over the hierarchy in the scene. So if you take the real part-whole hierarchy, you have kind of the universe, and then you have clusters of galaxies, and then you have just tiny individual galaxies, and you go all the way down to quarks, and you don't want to fit all those in your head at the same time. So if you think of the Bohr atom, for example, I believe that when you think about the atom as there's a kind of nucleus in the middle that's a bit like the sun, and there's electrons that are like planets, you're using exactly the same hardware as you use for thinking about the solar system. And what you've really done is taken that hardware and changed the mapping between reality and the hardware. So that's what you're doing when you change fixations and when you change attention. And that's a sequential process. But for each fixation, you'll choose a mapping between the hardware levels and the world. And the retina is a funny thing because you can also zoom by moving your eyes because of the way the retina is structured. And so that's part of the answer to the question. But the idea of skip connections is certainly useful for where the original input comes from. So if you ask, how is it initialized? You make a fixation, you've got all these embedding levels. Do you really only get information into the higher levels via the lower levels? And I think no, I think you have, to get the lowest level embedding, you'd have a convolutional neural network that looks at an image patch, maybe a bit more of the image as well, and produces a first bet for the lowest level embedding. But you'd also have convolutional nets for every other level too. So if you see a light colored oval, which is got a dark band about 3/5 of the way up, that's a very good bet for a face, even if a face is one of your higher level objects. And so you can directly initialize with that. So in that sense, you'd have skip layer inputs where you'd want to initialize all the levels at the same time.
Okay, thank you for the answer.
Any other question? Otherwise, I have many, so let's start. So what I liked when I read your capsule papers a few months ago was that this ability of combining parts to detect certain objects and so on. And I'd like to know how this is, it sounds a little trickier in this Glom because of the top-down and, well, this top-down and bottom-up interactions. So can you expand a little on that?
So in all of the Capsules papers, we didn't allow top-down interactions to change the representation at the level below. So we didn't allow real top-down. It was essentially a bottom-up thing that resolved ambiguities one layer at a time. This is more ambitious, and so that's why it's a bit more complicated. But also in the stacked capsule autoencoders, we're using a set transformer to get parts to disambiguate each other. And although we never really understood how it was doing it, the little explanation I gave of how a nose and a mouth would disambiguate via doing coordinate transforms, it had to be doing something like that. And that's in many ways more complicated than what Glom's doing, which is say, just go to the next level up, manage to, rather than resolving the ambiguity, transmit the ambiguity to the next level. And then you can, if you transmit it via coordinate transforms, then you can resolve it just by averaging, attention-weighted averaging. And that's a lot simpler. But it all depends on whether you really can represent these multimodal distributions. And I think actually neural nets can do that very well by using neurons as basis functions in an unnormalized log probability space.
Okay, thanks. Reza has a question.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful talk. So I had a question, which is about, so comparing like the human vision when we look at like some object, whenever we focus on something, that's very comparable to say images on ImageNet. They're object centric. So at least, you know, you can find like a large bounding box that contains that object. But say for 3D scenes, when you have like an entire 3D scene, sometimes we try to process that all at once. Do you think to apply self-supervised methods for 3D scenes, we should adopt like a similar method that kind of, and how can we do that? How can we go from like an object-centric view to like 3D scenes?
So we definitely use attention. So we've got trillions of synapses in our visual system. And even with trillions of synapses, we don't try and do everything all at once. We attend to some part of the image that's the size of your thumbnail at arm's length. And that's what we process in fine detail. And the sort of periphery is processed, small objects in the periphery are not recognized as objects. And so that aspect of Glom hasn't been sort of properly developed yet. And I'm very, at present, to keep the architecture simple, I've assumed sort of uniform resolution. All the columns have the same resolution, and that's clearly wrong. So there's more development needs to be done. And I basically believe we only see one object at a time. So the Gestalt distinction of figure and ground, I think, is very important. And human perception, you see it. But when you see an object, you definitely, in order to see the object, you have to be seeing its parts. So, I mean, I don't think I can see your face properly without having some representation of the eye. But when I focus on an eye, I've got a much richer representation of the eye than the representation I had when I was seeing your face. So there's lots more work to be done on the sequential allocation of attention. And this is just meant to be a model of what happens on a single fixation. So what's happening in inferotemporal cortex for a single fixation.
Thank you.
Thanks. I guess Nina Amenta has a question. Please, Nina.
Hi. I was wondering if anything interesting has come out in the way that these networks decide what parts are. You know, has it come up with a part of the face that I've never heard of before, or something like that?
Well, if this was a real system that was working nicely, I'd be able to answer that question. But
Yeah,
I can give you a partial answer. So neural fields in which you're using coordinate frames will they'll learn coordinate frames that line up with the natural symmetries of the object. If I've got an object with bilateral symmetry and I'm using rectangular coordinate frames, I'd be very well advised to make two of the axes of the coordinate frame lie in that plane of symmetry and have one perpendicular to it, because then the two halves of the object can be represented with only one more bit than one half of the object. So as soon as you learn these coordinate frames to work with neural fields, you'll get this effect that it's trying to choose the rectangular coordinate system to maximize symmetries. So that sort of relates to your question, although it doesn't really answer it. Okay, I think we're over time, so.
Wait, we have one more question by Keenan Crane, if you have time for some more.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for being here and giving this great talk. One comment you made at the beginning was using neural nets to understand scientific questions or model things in the natural universe rather than using them for engineering.
Actually, no, that wasn't what I said. That wasn't what I said.
Ah, okay.
So there's two very different relations in neural nets and science. One is use artificial neural nets for doing science like folding proteins. The other is use progress in artificial neural nets for understanding how the real neural nets work. So and they're rather different, right? They're very different. And it's the second one I'm interested in.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So that's what I gathered as well. And so I guess the question is, if you're a scientist doing that kind of work, what do you do to falsify your hypothesis? So you design this thing that's expressed in terms of a mathematical model or a neural net model. What actually is the empirical work, or what is the work you do to be able to falsify that?
Right. So if you take a computational neuroscientist who makes models and so on, the big advantage engineers have over a computational neuroscientist is they can falsify models by showing they just don't work. So until computers came along, you had all these theories of how the brain worked, like Hebb's theories of how the brain worked. And you didn't have the engineering approach to falsifying them by saying, look, it just doesn't work very well. And so that's our main route to falsification. And it's a different way of falsifying things from what empirical scientists use to say, let's predict the results of an experiment. But it's also a perfectly valid method of falsifying things by showing the theory just doesn't add up. So that's a sort of decision I made that I'm going to take sort of theories about how the brain works and see which ones could actually be made to work in an engineering sense. And that's a very good discipline.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a little more time if it's okay with you, Jeff, because there's a lot of questions coming. Okay. So Cheng has one.
Yeah. So thank you for this great talk. So I'm wondering, like, following up with Keenan's question that was about falsification, one thing about like human vision is that we use much less amount of unlabeled data. So I'm wondering, since you mentioned about code distillation and contrastive learning, I'm wondering like how could Glom be leveraged to use lesser amount of unlabeled data and in the process for both understanding it.
Right. So the idea is you would learn with no labeled data. You'd be learning this part-whole hierarchy. And if you think how BERT is trained, if you know about that language model, BERT is trained by leaving out a few words and then or word fragments, and it then has to predict those word fragments. So the equivalent for this would be to mask out a patch of the image and then let Glom iterate, and at the end of the iteration have filled in that patch of image. So that's like an autoencoder, a sort of partial autoencoder. And if you then add to that the contrastive objective of trying to make nearby patches of image have exactly the same representation, that's like the contrastive learning. It's a kind of generalization of contrastive learning of representations in which you're using attention to decide what should be the same as what, rather than just saying if two patches come from the same image, they should have the same representation. So those two sources of objective function of fill in missing bits and contrastively learn to make nearby things have similar representations, neither of them require labels. So it's basically designed to be an unsupervised learning system.
Thank you.
Thanks. Alec has the question.
Hi, thank you very much for that, for the great talk. I really enjoyed it. It reminded me of something I was reading about, like an old case in medicine where a patient was like stabbed or had some kind of injury to their brain, and they would look at a picture of a drawing of a human face, and they would recognize it as an apple. And then they would say like different parts of the apple were mapping to, like different parts of the face were mapping to parts of an apple. And I wonder, maybe connecting to Keenan's question, can like the ability to like replicate these like injuries to brains or like failures of the human brain be used to verify that our model of the brain is working well?
I happen to have one more slide in case somebody asks that question. I've got an article in Scientific American in 1992 or 1993 on semantic access dyslexia. So semantic access dyslexia is you take a brain damaged adult and you show them the word peach written in black letters on a white card, and they have to read it and they say apricot. Well, that's really weird, because how could they think it was apricot? Because they had to have thought it was peach because they read the word peach. And so psychologists found this really odd. As soon as we started making neural net models for word reading, for getting from the letters to the semantics, then what we discovered is if you have a model that has an attractor at the semantics level, so it has certain familiar sets of semantic features that form an attractor using lateral interactions, then it shows all these same phenomena. And it ceases to be weird at all. And what's happening is to get from the letters for peach to the semantics for peach, you've got a forward pathway that gets you into the right attractor for the semantics for peach. If you damage either the attractor or the forward pathway, the same letters can plonk you into an attractor that's nearby but isn't the same one, namely the attractor for apricot. And so very weird phenomena from a neuropsychologist point of view become perfectly mundane once you start making these neural net models. And that's the nicest example I have where there's an article about it.
Thanks.
Thank you. And I think we have no more questions. And since it's the end of the session, we are over time already. I'd like to thank you again for this very inspiring talk. And yeah, let's thank all our speakers again, although it's weird on Zoom.
And thank you for inviting me.